Silent Book Club by Evelyn Grace. Jill didn't mean to start a silent book club. She just wanted a Reuben and 30 minutes of people-adjacent solitude. She came to the deli every weekday at exactly 12:12 p.m. Not noon, too busy, with the lunch rush stampeding through like caffeinated buffalo. Not 12:30, too quiet, when the energy settled into that post-lunch lull that made her feel acutely alone. 12:12 was perfect, the sweet spot between chaos and silence. She sat at the small two-top near the window, ordered the same sandwich for Maria, extra pickles, light mustard, and opened her book. Today it was the Guernsey Literary and Potato Peel Pie Society, which she'd picked for its gentle humor and comforting way. It felt like letters from old friends, the kind of friends who understood that sometimes you needed stories more than conversation. It wasn't that she was lonely. Well, maybe she was a little lonely. Working from home as a freelance graphic designer meant she spent entire days talking only to her cat Winston and the notification chimes on Slack. She loved the quiet of her apartment, the way she could lose herself in color palettes and topography for hours without interruption. But sometimes the quiet pressed in too tightly, like a sweater that had shrunk in the wash. The deli was her compromise. She didn't have to talk to anyone, but the world hummed around her. Orders being called out in Maria's melodic accent, the door chime announcing new arrivals, the gentle hiss of the espresso machine. Life happening at a comfortable distance. Perfect. She didn't notice him at first. He was just another customer in the flow of people coming in for sandwiches and soups, slipping into a seat with a book of his own. Tall, dark hair that looked like he'd run his fingers through it, wearing the kind of worn flannel shirt that suggested he cared more about comfort than fashion. She noticed him only because he was quiet, like her. No laptop clicking with urgent emails, no phone calls conducted at volumes that suggested everyone needed to hear about his weekend plans. Just a book, a coffee, and what looked like a turkey club. He nodded politely if she glanced up, but didn't try to catch her eye or start conversations about the weather. She appreciated that more than she could say. It took her 3 days to realize he was coming in at almost the exact same time as she was, sliding into the table kitty corner to hers with the precision of someone who had also found his perfect timing. Always alone, always reading, always ordering something different. She'd noticed the turkey club, then a grilled cheese, then what looked like Maria's famous Cuban sandwich. She liked that too, the quiet consistency of his presence, the way he seemed to understand that some people came to public spaces not to be social, but to be alone together. The fourth day, she glanced up from a particularly funny passage about a pig named Dossie and froze. He was reading her book. Not just the same title, but the same edition. The paperback with the pale yellow cover and the illustration of a letter across it. She could see it was dog-eared at what looked like the same spot. A slip of what appeared to be a grocery store receipt marking the chapter she had just finished that morning, while Winston judged her breakfast choices. He looked up at that exact moment, as if he'd sensed her staring, and for one breathless second they made eye contact over the tops of their pages. He smiled, not the polite nod of previous days, but a real smile that reached his eyes and seemed to say, "You too?" She quickly looked down, heat rushing to her cheeks, pretending to read the same sentence about potato peel pie for the next 10 minutes, while her heart did something irregular against her ribs. The next day she switched tables, not far, just a little closer, to the two-top that would put her within easier viewing distance of his book. Her stomach flipped when he walked in at 12:15. She'd been watching the clock, and took his usual seat, setting down the Guernsey Literary and Potato Peel Pie Society with a soft thump, and giving her a small, knowing nod before flipping it open to where his receipt bookmark waited. She nearly forgot to eat her sandwich, too aware of the sound of pages turning across from her, too aware of how safe it felt to have him there, reading quietly alongside her, like they were part of something together, even without words. They never spoke, but Jill found herself looking forward to 12:12 in a new way that had nothing to do with Rubens. Maria, who had decided somewhere around day 2 that Jill was one of the regulars, refilled Jill's iced tea without asking and said, "Your friend's here," with a wink before bustling off to greet him with a kind of maternal warmth that suggested he too had achieved regular status. Jill wanted to protest. "He's not my friend. We've never even spoken." couldn't find the words. Was he her friend? If someone read quietly next to you for a week, sharing the same story at the same pace, was that enough to count as friendship? It felt more intimate than most of her actual friendships, which were built on shared complaints about clients and weekend plans that got canceled more often than not. It felt like enough. On Friday, Jill finished the book. She closed the back cover, holding it in her lap, thumb brushing the worn edges, and felt that familiar ache that always came when she turned the last page. The grief of leaving a world that had become real, of saying goodbye to characters who felt like friends. She glanced over, not entirely by accident. He was still reading, nearly at the end, judging by how few pages remained. His brow was furrowed in concentration, his thumb holding his place as if he couldn't quite let the story go yet. There was something achingly familiar about the expression, the same reluctance to finish that she always felt when a book was too good to end. He looked up then, met her eyes, and they both smiled. His was tinged with the same bittersweet recognition, and she knew he understood exactly what she was feeling. Neither of them said a word, but something passed between them anyway, an acknowledgement, a shared understanding of what it meant to love a story so much that finishing it felt like loss. Over the weekend, she picked her next book carefully. She carried potential candidates around her apartment, testing how they felt in her hands, how the covers looked, how the pages turned. Winston watched from his perch on the kitchen counter, green eyes judging her selection process with typical feline disdain. The printed letter bookshop felt right. Gentle, quiet, warm. Another story about books bringing people together, about the quiet magic of shared stories. It seemed fitting, given the circumstances. On Monday, she tucked it into her tote bag, heart pounding like she was about to jump out of a plane or ask someone to dance, some terrifying act of faith that would end in either joy or spectacular embarrassment. At 12:12, she took her seat and opened to page 1, hyper-aware of every sound, every movement in her peripheral vision. He came in at 12:15, as reliable as sunrise. He looked at her book, tilted his head with what might have been curiosity or approval, and gave her the smallest, softest smile yet before opening the final pages of Guernsey to finish. She watched from the corner of her eye as he read those last few chapters, saw the moment he closed the book cover with the same gentle reverence she'd felt on Friday. She wanted to talk to him, to say, that ending, right? The way Juliet found her family? Or, I picked a new book if you want to join. It's about a bookshop. Or even just, hi, I'm Jill, and I think we might be the same kind of person. But the words stuck in her throat like they always did. She'd never been good at beginnings, at the brave act of reaching across the space between strangers and saying, would you like to be friends? And maybe it was okay not to say them out loud. Maybe the shared stories, the synchronized reading, the quiet comfort of parallel solitude, was its own kind of conversation. On Wednesday, as she packed up to leave, she slipped a small note from her sketchpad. On it, she'd written in her careful, slanted designer's handwriting, next, the printed letter bookshop. Same time tomorrow? As she passed his table, she set the note beside his coffee cup, gave a small nod that she hoped conveyed confidence she didn't feel, and walked out the door before she could see his reaction. Her heart pounded all the way to her car, and she let out a shaky laugh, clutching her tote bag to her chest like armor. Winston was going to hear all about this whether he wanted to or not. Thursday arrived with the kind of nervous energy usually reserved for job interviews or first dates. She sat down at 12:12, opened the printed letter bookshop, and tried to focus on the first chapter while her eyes kept drifting to the door. At 12:15, the familiar chime sounded. He walked in, and her breath caught. He was carrying a copy of the printed letter bookshop under his arm, the same edition she'd chosen. He met her gaze across the small space, nodded with something that looked like gratitude mixed with anticipation, and sat down at his usual table. They opened their books to page 1. They never said a word, but it felt like the beginning of everything. For 2 weeks they read together in perfect synchronization. She left small notes. Page 127 made me cry, or chapter 15 is my favorite, and found them answered with tiny margin notes in his copy when he held it at the right angle to the light. Their silent conversation bloomed in the space between words, and shared glances over particularly moving passages, and the way they both lingered over the ending like it was too precious to rush. When they finished the printed letter bookshop, she left another note. The Berlin letters? The next day, he arrived with the familiar cover tucked under his arm. 3 months and 7 books later, Jill arrived at the deli at 12:12 to find someone else at her usual table, a businessman with a laptop and a loud phone voice that made her wince. She hesitated in the doorway, suddenly uncertain. Without her anchor point, the deli felt different, less like home, and more like just another public space where she didn't quite belong. Then she saw him. He was sitting at her table, the original two-top by the window, with a book open in front of him and a second cup of coffee waiting across from him. When he looked up and saw her hovering by the entrance, his face broke into the warmest smile she'd seen yet. He gestured to the empty chair. She had to decide. Join him at the same table for the first time? Cross that invisible line they'd been dancing around for months? Or retreat to safety and solitude? Her feet made the choice before her brain caught up, carrying her across the small space to where he waited. She sat down, and he smiled again, reaching across the table to offer his hand. "Hi," he said, his voice warm and slightly nervous, like someone speaking aloud for the first time after months of silence. "I'm Asher. Nice to meet you." She shook his hand, surprised by how perfectly it fit with hers, how right it felt to finally close the distance they'd been maintaining. "Jill," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she'd expected. "Nice to meet you, too." They sat there for a moment, hands clasped across the small table, surrounded by the familiar hum of the deli and the comfortable weight of all their shared stories. "So," Asher said, glancing down at the book between them. "The Summer of Yes," her latest selection. "Interesting concept, isn't it?" "The part about saying yes to something that scares you?" Jill asked, and felt something warm unfurl in her chest as he nodded. "Exactly that part." And just like that, their silent book club became something new, still quiet, still gentle, but no longer quite so alone.